The probability that Andre cycles to school is R. Write down, in terms of R, the probability that Andre does not cycle to school. In this situation, there are only two choices. Either Andre cycles to school or Andre does not cycle to school. Therefore, the probability that Andre cycles to school plus the probability that Andre does not cycle to school must equal 1. The probability that Andre cycles to school is R. Therefore, R plus the probability that Andre does not cycle to school must equal 1. And therefore, the probability that Andre does not cycle to school is 1 minus R. The probability that Benoit does not cycle to school is 1.3 minus R. The probability that both Andre and Benoit do not cycle to school is 0.4. Complete the equation in terms of R. The probability that both Andre and Benoit do not cycle to school must be the probability that Andre does not cycle to school, which was given in part A, multiplied by the probability that Benoit does not cycle to school, which was just given in part B. Show that this equation simplifies to 10r squared minus 23r plus 9 equals 0. We can start by expanding the brackets. The equation that we want to rearrange it into has everything on one side equals to 0. So what we can do is move everything to one side by moving the 0.4 to the left-hand side of the equation. And now our equation looks very similar to the equation that we want, except that the coefficient of r squared is 10. So we can change our coefficient of r squared to 10 by multiplying both sides by 10. And now we have simplified it into 10r squared minus 23r plus 9 equals 0. Solve by factorization 10r squared minus 23r plus 9 equals 0. To solve by factorization, we need to think about the factors of 10, which could be 1 times 10 or 2 times 5. And we also need to think about the factors of 9, which could be 3 times 3 or 1 times 9. And 2 times 9 plus 5 times 1 equals 23. So we can come up with a factorization form with this combination. By using the factors 2 and 5 for the factors of 10, and minus 1 and minus 9 for the factors of 9, we can factorize this expression, where our first bracket is 2r minus 1 and our other bracket is 5r minus 9. From factorization, we will get two answers. The first answer is from 2r minus 1 equals 0, which will give r equals 1 over 2. The other answer comes from 5r minus 9, which will give r equals 9 over 5. When the number in front of the x squared or the r squared in this case isn't 1, it can be a bit difficult to factorize. When you can't factorize, you can always solve a quadratic using the quadratic formula, but this question says solve by factorization, so the factorized form needs to be in your working out, otherwise you will not get the mark. In the end, if you still can't factorize it, you can always use the quadratic formula, and the answers you get for r, you can always turn it back into the factorized format later. When we use the quadratic formula, we will get r equals a half and r equals 9 over 5, just like we did when we solved by factorization. We can turn this back into the factorized format or figure out what would be inside the bracket by setting r equals a half, then rearrange to make 0 the subject of the formula, or make one side equal to 0. We will need to do the same for r equals 9 over 5. And from those two rearrangements of the equation, whatever is equal to 0 is inside the bracket of the factorization. So in this case, 2r minus 1 is in one bracket, and in the other bracket, we should have 5r minus 9. So after using the quadratic equation to find the value of r, and rearranging to find what is in the factorized format, make sure you write the factorized format in your working out to prove that you kind of solved it by factorization. Find the probability that Benoit does not cycle to school. In part B, it says that the probability that Benoit does not cycle to school is 1.3 minus r. And now that we already know the value of r, we can calculate the probability that Benoit does not cycle to school. But the problem is we have two answers for r equals a half and r equals 9 over 5. If we try out both values of r for 1.3 minus r, when r equals a half, 1.3 minus a half equals 0.8. If we try out r equals 9 over 5, 1.3 minus 9 over 5 equals minus 0.5. 1.3 minus r represents the probability that Benoit does not cycle to school, therefore it cannot be negative. Therefore the probability must be 0.8 and r must be 1 over 2.